I did very little.
Did she have it as well?
She ended up.
Oh yeah. I'm sure there's a film about that where like they have no.
Yeah.
Just like
Yeah.
No.
could have gone either way, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Half an hour. Oh, was it only half an hour? I thought it was a bit longer.
No, it's true.
Okay, that's not bad. My daughter left Ireland. We chopped left her for more than 6 months. But that's, she cycles to train, cycle, boat, cycle, train, and actually street trains. Yeah, no, it worked, yeah.
Beautiful, totally clear.
Yeah, the community.
So
Oh, I don't know. Loads of people with
Italian supposed to go on so
because we were like swimming once or twice a day, and it was like 100 meters out to a point, back out.
Well, that's pretty good.
They're quite good.
Yeah,
water there.
Just start now.
So what I was reading.
Hi everyone. Hello.
Hello. Somewhere that.
So we're gonna start now. So so I'm Sina from LAC, London Alumni Club. I'm part of the executive committee member, and I look after the different events that we organize. So if you don't follow us on LinkedIn, the London Alumni Club, for all the different events. We're gonna have, after the events at 8 o'clock, drinks upstairs. We will show you from 8 to 9 p.m. Thank you for coming. I know it's a very sunny weather outside. Can you hear me well? Yeah, very good. So for people who do not know Sam, let me introduce him a little bit. So he's MBA 1998, and he was a strategy consultant working for one for 15 years. And then after you moved to Tanzania for 6 years, and then
In Tanzania before, actually.
Yeah.
But
yeah, and then 3 years as a volunteer for BSO, and then since then he's been a climate change activist and a campaigner and communicator for Business Declares, and as well Climate Threats, and he's also a chairman for a charity called Change Drivers. So this event was very much at the initiative of Sam, who really has been pushing a lot on that particular theme, and really challenging us on our perspective, and especially on business degrowth. I've been working with him, for a few months, and I was a little bit unsure of this, but the turnout really shows that there is a need and an interest on this. So over to you, Sam, and then I'll let you introduce your speakers as well. So
great, Sina. Thank you. Thank you everybody for coming. Thank you everybody online. And thank you, of course, to the panelists and speakers. So just a little bit of context of my own. So given my age, I got into sustainability late 2015-16, so SDGs, Paris Agreement, so much excitement, and I thought that's what it was all about. I thought this was, just amazing. It was, everybody was so excited. There were so many commitments and coalition building, and I thought, wow, I found what I want to do. Great. That lasted about 3.5 years. And then it gradually gave way to cynicism. And I began to see, and to begin with, I thought maybe it was just my poor consulting skills, but then I began to see, company after company, deprioritizing whatever they said, prioritizing other things, particularly obviously financial growth, reneging on the commitments they made, dropping out of coalitions. And so, I got cynical about it, I got disappointed, I got angry. And what I was struck by was that every single big business was doing it. There wasn't a single exemplar, and I include Unilever in that. And then it became evident that, it occurred to me that if it's every single business, maybe there's something wrong with the system. So why is the system allowing, incentivizing, rewarding companies to act in a way which seems to be counter to the thing that we really need and want? And so, so on the back of that, I then started thinking about the polycrisis more broadly. So I had been thinking quite a lot about climate change. I tried to think about the polycrisis more broadly, and I characterised that just as really a sort of climate, biodiversity, loss, and then social inequality. Of course, you could add a few other things in there as well. I also thought about then the reasons for that, and this is thanks to the panelists and others in the room here. So great authors, works, canons of work. So and trying to drive into what I felt was actually wrong. What was driving this sort of really bizarre behaviour where people say they're going to do things and not, and yet there's this pressing need for big companies, big organisations, nation states to actually step up. So that was all sort of super confusing. I concluded, with the help of obviously many others, that is it the extreme financialisation of the system we live in. It's the hegemony of growth, the fact that growth is prioritised both at a national level and at a corporate level. And those are features and functions of the form of capitalism, and possibly capitalism itself, I don't know, but certainly the form of capitalism that seems to be playing out at the moment. So it seemed to me that there was no escaping it. Those might be root causes or in and around the root cause in some shape or form. But then so what? So where do you go from there? So if that is the sort of diagnosis, then what do? Do you work with the system, try and sort of adapt it? Do you replace it? And if you do replace it, what do you replace it with? What are our options? How do we look at it? And where are those options being played out? Are they in existence around the world or not? And so I'm very early stage in that. Luckily, other people aren't, and particularly some of my panelists. And so this is, in some way, this is selfish, because I've asked you to come here to help me on that journey, give me some of the answers that I don't have. And so I will introduce you very briefly, just through the agenda, so the panelists and speakers that we've got. You've all signed up. You will see on the sign-up sheets, on Business to Close website, you will see a fuller bio. But the idea then, after this, that we're going to have a vote, because the question is, how do we best survive the polycrisis? Yeah? Do we change or transform or replace the existing economic system? That's how we framed it. And of course, you can dig in and say, how do you define the system, blah, blah, blah. We're not going to do that, right? So look at that. We're going to ask you to vote on that. We're going to run a poll and for the online people, and we're going to ask you in the room what you think and through a show of hands. Okay, so we're going to do that at the beginning, and we're going to do that at the end. We're then going to have, two people. So we're going to have Simon, first of all. So Simon is a UK economist. He was part of the Climate Champions. He represented us on the economics front at COP26. Importantly, in 2023, he published his book, and I recommend you to read that. So he's going to start off, and arguably more on the change end of the spectrum, so talking about what we need to do to address the polycrisis, particularly climate change. We're then going to hand over to Mike Albert. Mike Albert dialing in with COVID from California. Thank you, Mike. So Mike has also written a book focusing on the polycrisis. So he's then going to pick up and probably arguably more on the other end of the continuum, but we'll find out soon. So Mike's going to talk to us about that. We've then got four people who are then going to both reflect on what we've heard, but also they've all got their own opinions as well. So hopefully we'll hear a bit of both. And we should also have an opportunity for some questions from the floor as well. And so in order, so we've got Dominique Palmer, climate activist, known to many here. We've got Hans Stegemann, so Hans, the chief economist at Triodos Bank, also an opinion writer in the newspapers, so look out for that, look out for blogs. Rachel Donald from Planet Critical, so journalist, now author, and obviously podcaster. And then Tim Freneau, who runs a business. Have I pronounced it correctly?
Not quite.
Ah, okay, must have been close. But anyway, so Tim Freno runs a business, very also a podcaster and also a blogger, and so we'll hear from Tim as well. So thank you so much, everybody, for coming and being with us. Thank you very much for the thoughts you're going to share. We will ask Mike and then Simon to respond after that dialogue that we've had, and then we'll wrap up with a couple of final words from the four, and then we'll revote and see where we got to, okay? So hopefully I don't break everything by running a poll here, but we're going to do a poll for the online people, and we're going to do a show of hands in the room, but the panelists I don't think can vote. So the entry poll, just for the people, you can all see that, I hope. Can you not see it? You can't see that. So in the room, so the question is, what needs to happen to our economic system to ensure we weather the polycrisis? 1, change; 2, transform; 3, replace. So I've launched that for the online people. So what, show of hands, if you're at the change end. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, something like that. It's about 7. What about the middle option? So 5, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 27, so 727. I saw some people voting twice, but that's okay. And then what about replace? Sorry, replace. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. So it's about, okay, 27, 13, 7. Okay, so a big sort of bell curve there by the look of it, sort of 7 to 13 on either end and 27 in the middle. And what's happening online? So we've got 29, okay, 3, 55, 41. Interesting, okay. So because I'm such a technology numpty, I'm actually going to take a picture of that. I probably should do something else. Okay, good. Thank you, everybody, for playing that game. I think it's important. Just share those. Yeah, can you see them? Okay.
I think your transformation definition is a bit problematic.
Semantics.
Yeah, exactly. No.
Let's have a whole debate about definition.
Okay, so now can we then start with you, Simon? So hang on, let me stop showing this. Get rid of that. Simon, can you hear us?
Yes, thanks,
Okay.
Sam.
So
How's that? Okay. Great. Well, thank you, Sam. Thanks for inviting us. I think this is going to be a really interesting discussion. I'm very much looking forward to hearing from the other people on the panel. The extent of the risk that we're facing from climate change. In the IPCC's plausible worst case scenario, global sea level rise could be more than 5 meters within the next 150 years. That is beyond London's limit of adaptation, according to the only estimate that I'm aware of. So it probably means nobody would be sitting in the place where you're all sitting. Within the next decade, tens of millions of people could experience heat and humidity combinations that exceed the limits of human tolerance. Those are conditions that people have never been exposed to before. Tipping points in ice sheet stability, the Amazon rainforest, permafrost, probably being quite rapidly approached, maybe even being crossed as we speak. Biodiversity loss accelerating, and we barely understand what consequences that will have for us. So I think it's reasonable to describe that set of risks as existential for human civilization. And so you might think, well, that means our response should involve asking existential questions about our way of life and this thing that we call the economy. And it probably should. But before we immediately decide that this is about replacing everything about our current system, we have to think about one of the defining features of the climate change problem, and that is the fact that we have to solve it quickly. Every year that we have anything more than 0 emissions, the risks carry on getting larger. And every year that emissions go up or stay the same, the faster we need to reduce emissions to avoid a given level of danger. Now, when I wrote my book the other year, as you mentioned, I called it 5 times faster. And the reason for that was that over the past 2 decades, global emissions per unit GDP fell by around about 1.5% per year. And to meet the internationally agreed goal of limiting global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees, that rate of emissions reduction per unit global GDP needs to be around 8% per year this decade on average. But that's a calculation I did a few years ago, and that was based on numbers that started around the beginning of this decade. Now we're nearly halfway through this decade, and global emissions haven't started falling yet. So the acceleration that we need now in principle is even greater. Maybe it's something like 8 times faster. So we have to go extremely fast to avoid this problem continuing to get more dangerous. That overwhelming need to make progress quickly and on a large scale means leverage is extremely important. We have to achieve the largest possible changes from each small input of social, political, or financial capital. We can't afford to waste any effort, because wasted effort is wasted time. We know that policy can be high leverage. If we think about the UK, on most measures, we haven't done very well in reducing emissions. We've not done well in agriculture, industry, transport, buildings, but we have done well in the power sector. Over the last decade, we decarbonized our power sector roughly 8 times faster than the global average. We did this with the same technologies that were available to other countries and with no particularly abundant resources of political leadership. Over the same period, some countries went in the opposite direction, increasing the carbon intensity of their power systems. The difference between the UK and the global average, and the difference between the UK and those other countries that went backwards, was policy. In another sector, the only other one where we've collectively made much progress, road transport, Norway has moved much faster than any other country. A few years ago, when that transition was just getting started, Norway's electric vehicle share of car sales was 20 times higher than the global average. And that's in a major oil exporting country, which stands to lose revenues as electric vehicles destroy global demand for oil. Norway did that through policy. California is moving to electric vehicles around 4 times faster than the rest of the USA, and China is moving faster than the EU. Despite having completely different political systems, social preferences, and economic situations, those 2 regions have made fast progress using a very similar set of policies to each other. That shows you the leverage that policy can have. Now, that doesn't mean everything is fine. New solutions always create new problems. That's the way of things. And of course, I want to say it before somebody else does, that we can and should be concerned about the environmental damage being done by mining minerals for batteries. But think about pace. There's no plausible alternative to electric vehicles for decarbonizing road transport globally within the next 10 years. So the response is to work on battery chemistries and mining standards, not to stick with petrol cars and hope that something else comes along. RMI estimates that with continued improvements in battery chemistry and recycling, the extraction of minerals for EV batteries could more or less end in the 2040s, and the total tonnage of materials extracted over all of that time will be 1/17 of the amount of oil that is extracted and used in road transport every single year. The fact that global emissions are still rising does not mean that none of our policies are working. Emissions are a lagging indicator of change. We're at the early stage of the S-curve in each of the technology transitions that need to happen. So this is what we expect. The fact that emissions are still rising just shows that we started late and we've done too little. It doesn't show that we do not know what to do. There have been many socio-technological transitions in the past. We can see how they happened, and we can see what kind of actions influenced their pace. That history points us to where policy and activism and leadership of all kinds can have the greatest leverage. It also shows that innovation is central to transitions. So we need an economic system that can drive rapid development of new solutions. If we want to replace capitalism, then we have to ask ourselves how quickly that can be done. A fundamental change in economic system would almost surely imply a change in the power structure of society. So it's worth asking, how long does that usually take? How long did it take to end colonialism? 1 or 2 or 3 centuries? What about communism? Maybe between half a century and a century, depending on when you think it started. How long do countries take to move from authoritarianism to democracy? Many have tried for half a century or more, even within the last century. So we'd have to be very confident to think that we could replace capitalism with an alternative system of political power and economic production within the 5 years that we have to halve global emissions. And all of that is assuming that we know what the replacement for capitalism looks like. But do we? And if not, how long will it take us to think one up? And how long will it take to get a social and political consensus behind it? Most developed countries and democracies have right-wing political parties and significant numbers of people who vote for them. If you tell those people we need to overthrow capitalism, how do we expect them to respond? To eliminate global emissions as quickly as possible, we need to make it as easy as possible for people to act and vote in a way that's consistent with that goal. And that includes a large number of people, not just the people who are the activists at the forefront pushing this transition, but also all of the people who enjoy eating meat, flying around for foreign holidays, and reading right-wing newspapers. If you want people's consent for the largest and fastest deliberate structural change in the global economy and human history, which is what decarbonization is, then don't ask them to change any more than they need to. Give them the same goods and services or better ones, but without creating emissions. And don't make it any more difficult than it already is. So a final word, what about economic growth? Are we addicted to it? Well, quite possibly yes. Will it destroy us? I think not necessarily. And it does depend how we define it. The economic system is very likely to be dependent on growth in financial terms, the way we currently have it set up. And society wants growth in terms of improving living standards, or as Eric Beinhocker has described it, an increasing diversity of solutions to human problems. There's no reason in principle why either of these forms of growth should depend on increasing the material throughput of the economy. There's no law of physics that requires that, and there's no law of economics that requires that. The shift from petrol cars to electric vehicles is one good example of a transition in technology that gives people a superior product, faster, cheaper, and more reliable, and at the same time reduces material throughput of the economy. If we define growth in terms of the diversity of solutions to human problems, then there's no in principle reason not to be pro-growth. So in conclusion, we've got every reason to believe that well-targeted policy, activism, and investment can eliminate emissions from the global economy, and while allowing people's living standards to continue to improve. So if this is a fight for the survival of human civilization, then let's not pick any unnecessary battles, and instead let's be quite ruthless in focusing our energy on the points of greatest leverage. Thank you.
Mike.
Thanks, Sam. And thanks, Simon, for a great opening. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. So in my view, I think Simon gives us a really great, compelling analysis of like what we need to do now to shift the dial on decarbonization, because we have to address this crisis quickly. We cannot wait until we have a replacement system. That's absolutely true. And so we need this kind of near-term pragmatism. But I think we also need to be clear about what this approach can ultimately achieve. And if we are serious about actually solving these crises in a just manner that enables sustainable well-being for the majority of the Earth's population, then we need to imagine alternatives to the global capitalist system. And yeah, that's not going to be possible within a 5-year time frame, but the goal needs to be to act as quickly as we can within the current system while working towards broader system transformation, working towards, in Sam's terms, replacing the system within something like a 15 to 20 to 30 year time frame. And whether or not we, however, we need to do it as quickly as we can. And realistically speaking, it will take time, but the goal needs to be to replace that system as quickly as possible, even if we're working on a longer time frame there. So I'm talking about replacing capitalism. And so let me briefly define, what I understand by capitalism. So this is an economic system in which decisions about production and investment are predominantly controlled by private capital. So actors like asset managers, large banks, transnational corporations, and their shareholders. And so in this system, the overriding objective of the economy is more or less synonymous with the core objective of private capital, which is to maximize profit and economic growth. And here we need to be very clear. Economic growth is measured for the capitalist system in terms of GDP, gross domestic product. And so, one could say, well, we can think about growth in terms of living standards and well-being, but for the system, in the way in which it actually works within our system is that we're talking about maximizing gross domestic product, measured in terms of the amount of profit, monetary transactions, spending within a national economy. And so, of course, there are multiple varieties of capitalism, but we need to be clear that all of these varieties of capitalism, they require endless growth. A no-growth capitalism is kind of an oxymoron, because non-growing capitalism means crisis, recession, mass unemployment. And so the core challenge has always been, how do we make this growth compatible with sustainability? Is it even possible? And so the kinds of technological shifts and policies that Simon lays out, no question this would take us in the right direction towards a greener form of capitalism. But greener is not green, and aligning our economy with planetary boundaries will ultimately require going beyond growth towards a post-growth, post-capitalist economy. And so let me talk about a couple core reasons why this is most likely the case. And so first of all, we don't yet see any clear evidence that capitalist states are capable of reducing emissions at the speed needed to keep global temperature increases around 1.5 degrees. So in the UK, it's well established, the UK is one of the best climate performers globally, but even the UK is well off track to meet its net zero by 2050 targets. And of course, the situation, it's even bleaker in other rich countries like Germany, US, Australia, wherever you look in the global north. But the problem goes deeper than this, because the problem is that the goal of net zero by 2050 for rich countries, it's fundamentally inadequate from a global justice perspective. So if we're trying to get the world to net zero by 2050, this means rich countries who are obviously vastly, share the disproportionate burden for the problem, we need to be getting there significantly earlier. So arguably at least by 2040, if not earlier. And so I have to emphasize that, this isn't just about doing, what's morally right. This also has a clear strategic logic, because if we want to pressure emerging economies like China and India to get to net zero by 2050, to give the world a shot at 1.5 degrees, this can only be realistically done if the rich countries are getting there earlier, probably at least by 2040. But this would really require a dramatic acceleration, even faster, I believe, than what Simon has indicated. And so some, like Kevin Anderson at the Tyndall Center for Climate Change, suggest this would mean something like 15% annual emissions reductions in the rich countries. Others like Jason Hickel, Jeffrey Vogel say that this could be even higher, something like 20 to 30% annual emissions reductions. And I mean, it depends on the specific country we're looking at and their decarbonization trajectory to date. But in comparison, global emissions fell by roughly 6% in 2020 in the context of the COVID lockdowns and the 3% economic contraction. And so we're talking about year-on-year annual reductions that would be much faster than what we saw in 2020 in the context of the contraction. And so to get anywhere near the speed of decarbonization, we're talking about sustained warlike mobilization that would need to dramatically reduce energy demand and shutter various forms of industrial production that are not necessary to meet social and ecological goals. So things like arms manufacturing, yachts, SUVs, fast fashion, etc. Also, rather than putting our faith in future technological innovations to decarbonize hard to abate sectors like steel, cement, chemicals, and aviation. Instead, the focus would have to be on shrinking these industries to the largest extent possible. And we'd also be looking in this scenario at massive stranded assets of fossil fuels that would need to be left in the ground and infrastructures that would need to be canceled before the end of their lifespan. Something like 15 trillion in stranded assets, according to one study. And so we're talking here about a dramatic political and economic shift that would almost certainly be incompatible with continuous economic growth measured in terms of GDP in rich countries. And so, of course, I'll be the first to admit, like, this has no chance in hell of happening anytime in the immediate future. But in 15, 20 years from now, when the climate crisis is intensifying and rich countries are dealing with unprecedented energy, food, and financial crises, this kind of transformation, it becomes thinkable. I'm certainly not going to say that it's the most likely scenario, but it's certainly within the realm of plausibility and what we need to fight for and build towards in order to give us a real chance at addressing these crises. And of course, this would also require the kind of reforms that Simon talks about in the immediate term to begin accelerating, but then those deeper reforms, those deeper transformations later on to really put the pedal to the metal and shift into higher gear to solve these crises. So moving to my second point. So I've only been talking about the climate crisis, but the bigger question here is whether capitalism can stop the broader assault on the Earth's biodiversity. And so we need to put this in perspective here. And so for this to happen, the global economy would need to be able to keep growing while also reducing its overall material and ecological footprint. And so it would have to absolutely decouple in the terms of ecological economists. But the evidence to date shows that at the global scale, this is not happening. Global raw material consumption, which is a useful proxy for the economy's ecological footprint, it continues to rise roughly in line with global GDP. And so this is what the UN Environmental Program shows us in its latest global resource outlook, for instance. And so to try and put the implications in perspective, if global GDP growth is continuing unabated at about 2 to 3% annually, this means the global economy is going to be roughly three times larger by 2060 compared to today, and potentially up to 10 times larger by the end of the century. So, I mean, something has to give here. Earth system scientists say we're already in the danger zone for 6 of 9 planetary boundaries, or the zone in which we risk crossing irreversible tipping points. And so the Earth can hardly take more pressure than what we're already giving it. Yet the global economy would be on track to roughly double its material footprint after mid-century. So this would almost certainly mean ecological disaster. And this would also be the case even if the growth is powered by renewable energy systems. So, I mean, Simon has already acknowledged the immense land use and material impacts. Sorry, what's that?
You're going to have to wind up, and then you'll be able to have 5 more minutes at the end.
Got it. Yeah, no worries. So I mean, that in a nutshell there is the ecological case for capitalism, basically saying that this continuous growth, even if powered by renewables, would be a catastrophe. And so we need to, as rapidly as possible, begin to shift towards a post-growth alternative. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay, so now we move on to sort of shorter inputs. So we've got Dominique first, and then if people in the room, if you've got a burning question, obviously shout out. If not, then we'll just roll forward. We'll have Dominique, then we'll pipe you in, then we'll go to Rachel, and then we'll finish with Tim. Okay. So just bear in mind, everybody who's listening, do you have a thing about what we said at the beginning, the backgrounds of these people, super interesting, and then listen to what they have to say in that context, please. So, Dominique, over to you. And sorry, I will be rude and cut people off if it's not too long.
Thank you, Sarah. So I really resonate with some things that Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you, Sam. So I really resonate with some of what Mike was just saying and talking about in the absolute need to think beyond green capitalism, that this economic system is one that is based upon infinite growth and the exploitation of our planet and people at the profit is the priority over people in planet and the well-being of that over all else. And that at its core is something that is not in sync with a livable future. So I'm coming at this as a climate justice activist. That is my focus, and that has really shaped who I am as an activist and environmentalist. My perspective on climate justice extends to the broader polycrisis. So we live in this system that has this exploitation, this exploitative system that has created the fossil fuel crisis, which many of us have heard Antonio Guterres, UN Secretary General, call unhinged and complete madness, and that those who are advocating for the end of this and the radical transformation are not the radicals. The radicals are the countries and those who continue to put us further into this crisis and continue this madness. But essentially, it's really important to not look at people and planet as sacrifice zones. That's really important to me, that is not dismissed. And the thing about capitalism is that decades of this and oppression has dictated who is disproportionately impacted by the crisis and who is allocated the resources to mitigate it. People are facing the crisis today, they are disproportionately impacted, and we have to think about inequality broadly in terms of changing power structures and resources. And I guess you could say the moral case of this, but something that also makes sense, is thinking about how this is not compatible with the system that we need. So, for example, we can think beyond capitalist solutions when it comes to the climate crisis. Indigenous communities, for example, protect over 80% of the world's biodiversity, which is essential for the biodiversity crisis. And one solution to this is supporting Indigenous land rights. Another thing is not looking at single solutions as kind of like the holy grail for what we need. For example, electric vehicles, while this transition in transportation is important, at the same time, there are so many cases of this extraction being associated with slave labor and exploitation of people in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And we can't, it's really important not to carry on with this kind of exploitative mindset and dismiss the people along the way and think about how are we taking action, and not just action only looking at the emissions, but also the consequences of this. And also, for example, sometimes see a lot of focus on electric vehicles, which, as I say, is needed. But also, if we focus entirely on that, the issue of accessible and affordable transportation for the everyday person then kind of falls to the wayside, and that is something that also needs incredible amounts of funding and effort put into it. Another example I just want to give about how inequality is a really part of this is an example of most climate refugees being women due to inequalities faced in society. But there are many communities where women are leading in their communities, who work with the land, who are caretakers, and One Climate Solution is actually funding and supporting them. In the Women's Political Empowerment Index actually shows a reduction of emissions with the increase of empowering women and women's education. And this is just one small example. There was also the point that Mike mentioned about, GDP. This is how we look and measure country success over, well-being of people and planet. And essentially, this system really pushes forward individual, infinite growth over community and over the collective well-being that we have. And this current cycle of exploitation will only continue if we continue on with green capitalism, as there currently are a lot of loopholes that have been suggested in policy that give industries a chance to continue pollution without structurally changing what they're doing, without changing business models. And I will wrap up now, because I believe my time is almost over. So I'm much more on the side of taking measures that are in line with an alternative system to capitalism. I also don't believe we're going to have the revolution tomorrow, but we can start taking measures that are more in line with the future that we want to see. Otherwise, we will continue down this path of infinite growth and exploitation of people and planet. And it's really, really important that no person or community or people are seen as sacrifice zones. And very lastly, because I forgot, there's also the importance of, I think, global climate reparations when it comes to climate justice. some countries who have committed, for example, Mozambique has contributed 0.02% to global climate emissions, but has been ransacked by cyclones, etc. There are so many countries that have similar cases of this, and they are also being asked to transition at this speed, while these countries, due to decades and histories of colonialism, are also in incredible amounts of debt. And this is a massive, massive problem, and that really needs to be addressed if everyone is actually able to transition to a green future. And the richest countries who have historic responsibility have the responsibility to pay for that transition, essentially. And that is really, really important. So I just wanted to hammer home on the justice side of things and people not being dismissed as a sacrifice for the sake of the greater good, especially for us here in the West.
Well, let's hear from you, and then let's pick up a question or two from the floor here, and then we will go to Rachel and Tim. So, Hans, do you want to go in?
Sorry, it's sometimes difficult to hear. Hopefully you hear me. Thanks, very interesting conversation already. I don't want to reiterate what was already mentioned. I want to add to part of the discussion, maybe 4 points. The first point is on the polycrisis. I think we did not discuss it and went to climate, and mostly to climate. And I think I was expecting Mike to add more to it, but we are in a very difficult situation, and it is not only climate, it's even not only resources and biodiversity, but it's the combination of crises. We have also social inequality, power, and within the economic system itself, we have also a problem. Those problems together makes where we are. And also my position on it, that I say, yeah, it will be very difficult to keep the system the same. And maybe for a different reason that was said before. If we look at, so I agree, we have a growth-dependent economic system. But there's one, I call it a within system problem, that in some countries, like in most of the developed world, we have a problem with economic growth. We have aging, and innovation is not delivering what is expected. So it seems like Simon was talking about the S-curve in innovation. We've also an S-curve in economic development. And if that S-curve comes to the end, it means it's flat. And if you have a growth-dependent system, which is not growing, you have a within-system problem. So without any discussion on ecosystems or whatever, we have to discuss if this system can stay the same. And that has profound consequences for how you can have a discussion on it. So then it's not about some sustainability goal or whatever, it's just a system that's not working. And the third point I want to add to that, we did not touch so much on tipping points, only in the ecological sense, but we have the same in the social sense. So we also have their social tipping points. They are in the literature often framed as something positive, but possibly it can also be negative if you don't have the right vision and ideas of how you should organize a society. And I think there's also an opportunity there to say, okay, we have a system that might collapse for whatever reason. We should have better ideas than this system, and nobody actually knows exactly, but we should have work on those ideas, because probably we get windows of opportunity that can go completely the wrong way if we don't have any plans. So we should have those plans in place. And that brings me also to my final point on how transitions work. There are always three things that you have in transitions, and I think we're almost at a point where you feel the tension in the system and we can go somewhere. So a part of it, and that's also what I do quite often, is criticize the current system. What's wrong, what's not working. That's needed to make people aware of what should be different without giving any other options. The second thing we should do is give a vision. Where can we go? Because the dangerous part of criticizing the system is that a large part of the population think, oh, this is not the way, we should go back, for instance. So they don't share a vision that so you also have to work on that vision. And the third point, which was not mentioned up till now, is that there are so many things we can do. And that's therefore our work in the financial sector, and to show that you can also make different choices as a person, as an organization. And those initiative, grassroots movements, and everything we can do helps to inspire your vision, and also helps to inspire a society to go to the right direction. It's not a guarantee, absolutely not. But if we don't have those private initiatives and expect that everything should come from elected politicians, we definitely fail. So I think that's what we can do. So to give a little bit of hope, before or after I said that probably will have a collapse, we should work on that part. So.
Okay, have you got any questions from the floor? If not, we'll go to Rachel. We do have one.
I'll leave it to later.
Okay, leave it to later. We have one here.
Please, then.
Yeah, if you can, I don't know if you can see if you can hear the question. I'll paraphrase it, and I'll be able to hear you.
Rupert Mead, Climate Majority Project. I'm a huge admirer of the panelists, and we've had great contributions already. But can I urge us, we're among friends here, right? Can I urge us to go even further with a reality check? So even Mike, for example, spoke of staying below 1.5 degrees. Please, folks, we have already gone through 1.5 degrees. Before anybody says, well, no, we haven't technically, because we could go back down again for a while. As Richard Betts's work has very clearly shown and others, any sane measure of when we pass 1.5 degrees is going to average something like 10 years before now, with 10 years after now. Now, if you really think we're going to go back down below 1.5 degrees for most of the next 10 years in such a way that everything's going to be fine, 1.5 degrees is gone. And this is just fine, but never mind before we get to the Polycrisis. Right? So please can we have a starting kind of basis for this discussion, which acknowledges the true awfulness of the situation. And only if we do so are we going to get serious about thinking about the response. We've been speaking mostly so far as if the main issue is mitigation. The main issue now, I would say, is adaptation. Is how do we cope with the climate impacts, which are going to destabilize us and probably derail us quite quickly unless we move on them very, very quickly indeed, 10 times faster.
Thank you. That definitely wasn't a question, but it was a good intervention, so thank you for that. So, Rachel, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. I almost don't really know where to start. I think maybe the first thing that I want to pick up so far has been this focus on urgency. And Bayo Kumalafi is a great quote where he says, you know, the times are urgent, we need to slow down. When the situation is in such a crisis point, we can also achieve things like reducing emissions, reducing material footprint, reducing whatever, and buying ourselves some years by reducing our output. It doesn't have to be putting our foot on the accelerator with regards to certain technologies or certain policies in order to then hopefully maybe achieve that same thing, even though when that has been deployed in the past, it has never really resulted in a lowering of emissions or material footprint or whatever. So I feel like that's a tool that we often forget. We can try and chill out. We can try and impose a kind of similar to, you know, COVID on all of us, which was awful that year because obviously none of us saw it coming and it was very difficult for our societies and our communities. But it would be possible, for example, to say, do you know what, for 1 year, no private jets. Sorry, no private jets because, you know, the planet's almost hotter than the sun and we need to buy ourselves some time. Those are actions of slowing down that can be incredibly helpful, especially when it doesn't look like we have political leadership that actually knows what actions to take and to be speeding up in such a crisis. The other thing I want to do is, you know, we've kind of talked about the economic system, but I want to zoom out even further. Capitalism gets a really, really bad rap. I am not a capitalist. I don't have enough money to be a capitalist, for one. But also there are entrenched sort of problems of relationality that go beyond capitalism. If you look at our legal system, for example, and the fact that essentially it was created to ensure the protection of private property for a minority class compared to everybody else, and how that really has filtered out through the social relationships between classes in society and also between countries. I think there was a claim earlier today that colonialism ended. I don't think that is true. We do exist in neo-colonial systems whereby nations in the majority world are deliberately burdened with debt in order to ensure that they cannot benefit from the resources that they have. It's called the resource curse, and that private companies and other state bodies can move in and extract from them. And I think that it's really important to remember that it's not just an economic problem, because it's impossible to actually silo any part of the human existence into economy and politics, or power over here and technology over here. All are forming relationships all of the time, which create this incredibly complex system within which we exist that makes it really, really difficult to grasp. And I say that because, to try and zoom out even further, Mike has talked a little bit about, and Hans, about this like impossible of absolute decoupling, that we can't, there's no research that shows that it's possible to long-term decouple your emissions and your GDP, your economic output. There is no research that shows that decoupling of material footprint is possible as well. And it was just earlier this year that, speaking with some physicists and economists, I started to kind of try to identify this matrix, essentially, of the relationship between our energy, our materials, and our civilization. And it seems that human beings use energy to do a phase transformation of stuff in the world, typically the Earth's crust, to turn it into things that we want. And often what that results in is that the natural abundance of the living world is transformed using energy into individual wealth, or the wealth of a few, essentially. And so even if, and I personally don't think it's possible, right? But even if we could decarbonize our energy systems, although I'm not entirely sure what that means, given that carbon is, the building block of the planet. But even if we could get 100% clean energy, we will always live on a finite planet with finite materials that we will be transforming into other things that we want. And so we fundamentally need to address our relationship to those materials, because if we can see anything from our sort of human appetite, or even the appetite of every single biological thing on this planet, we use the available energy that we have to do something to maintain ourselves, which typically looks a little bit like growth, until we eventually decay and die. And so just focusing on our energy system is not enough, because what we will see is the continuing destruction of biodiverse hotspots, which has already been mentioned, in order to create an industry for electrical vehicles, which is often touted as like a climate solution, but is much more strictly linked to political power plays that are happening around the world, particularly in Europe, with regards to the fact that it's the only form of industrialization that is left in this part of the world. We will see the continuing dispossession of people. We will see a continuing problem with regards to all of the climatic issues that also are not problems of the future, are not problems of 10 years or 15 years, but are problems of today. And just because in the West, essentially what we're seeing are like, well, certain some parts of the West, you're seeing awful hurricanes and tornadoes and whatever, but islands are already going underwater. People are already being displaced. Millions around the world are at risk. Look at the wet bulb temperature. Research came out that it could be as low as 26 degrees that could be deadly for a wet bulb temperature. And look at what's happening in India. India, who last year restricted the export of rice in order to feed its own population. It is not a problem of the future. It is a problem of today. And until we really begin to attempt to understand, and also have the humility to say that we can never fully understand the interdependence of all of these systems, and that there's not just one thing that we can engineer or one thing that we can tinker with over here in order to facilitate the continuing growth of this particular system, which seems mad because it doesn't really seem to be benefiting anybody, as far as I can see, then I think that we won't really be able to take any kind of action that actually tackles this problem.
Thanks, Sam. Hello, everyone. It's a tough gig, isn't it? And after all this song. I was really pleased with the framing of the session on polycrisis, and I want to revert to that to make a couple of points to start out with. And one is that Sam summed it up as, I think it was climate, ecological, and social issues in the polycrisis. The polycrisis isn't just things going wrong. It's that for a lot of people, let's face it, most of us, things are going right. It's all right. There isn't really a crisis because for us, it's fine. So the polycrisis isn't just a series of things going wrong. It's that they're unevenly distributed. And this picks up Dominic and Rachel's points about inequality and injustice. And that is a core problem with the polycrisis that's often overlooked because we think it's just a bigger version of the climate crisis. It's not just a bigger version of the climate crisis. It's a system that is failing. It's an old system that was designed at a different time when we didn't realise that we were living within a finite planet and we thought that growth could go on forever. And yes, some of us did really well out of it, and some of us are still doing really well out of it. And that is as much a part of the polycrisis as climate change, as the housing crisis, as mental health problems, as diabetes, as anything else that you can pick. There's some, on some measures, some people think that things are going okay. Okay, that's one part of the polycrisis framing. The other one I want to pick up is this idea that the polycrisis is out there in the system. The system's in crisis, so what we're going to do? How are we going to survive the system being in crisis? There is no system. We're the system. Polycrisis isn't out there. It's in here, in all of us, in the decisions we take, in the choices that we make, in the ways that we try to be human, because we've forgotten what it is to be human. And I'll come back to that in a minute. I want to come back to that in a moment. There was a point about, well, we don't know what the alternative to capitalism would look like. Well, yeah, we do know what the alternative to capitalism would look like. There's a whole range of alternative business models which are not predicated on growth. It just so happens that at the moment, our economy is based on finance and business that has life in service to it. Whether you think about the natural resources which are used to create goods or people's lives in service to finance and business and growth. But you can still have businesses. You just turn it around, and that business needs to be in service to life. Finance needs to be in service to life. That's the process. That's what regeneration is all about. Perpetuating the generations in future. That's the long-term understanding of how you live within a bounded finite planet. So we need to move past that simplistic understanding, and then because businesses, yeah, we can't throw that baby out with the bathwater. They are the most powerful form of collaboration we've ever had. That's what we created businesses for, to work together. The root of company means eat bread, companion, the people you eat bread with. It's a form of collaboration. We need to keep it, but just save business from finance, save business from growth. And then the final bit, back to that thing about the polycrisis not being out there, it being in here. Well, we've forgotten what it means to be human. We've failed in our imagination of what we can be as a species. And that's what the polycrisis is really showing us. So in some senses, the polycrisis isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's a mirror that's being held up to society to go, come on, guys, you're better than this. You are so much better than this. And this big, many-headed hydra of a monster, the polycrisis, is what's telling us that. And as soon as we start to recognize that if we can't change the system, but we can change ourselves, and we grow our perception, our awareness, our emotions, so that when you start talking about these things, you nearly burst into tears in front of a room full of hundreds of people you've never met before. That's all right. And that's the place we need to get to. You don't need to grow the moustache. Don't worry about the moustache. But that's where we need to get to. We need to recognize that we're in the process of evolving as a species to be able to live within our ecological niche. We're moving from being an industrial society to an ecological civilization. And that is a very long-term process. I guess to pick up some of the things that we've talked about, you could see it as the difference between ending slavery and ending decolonialization. That's the short term and the long term, the climate change and the polycrisis. Thank you.
Very good. So I see couple of hands, few hands going up in the floor. We'll have two questions, then I'm going to ask a question.
So I appreciate everyone kind of discussing this, but when you were putting the panel together, who within the panel had you said was going to come up with some kind of solution or action? You know, who should we address all of this to? Because at the moment it feels like a lot of questions and crises, and we want to walk away with a little bit of hope.
Okay, so that's again, I don't know, well, that was a question to me, how you put the panel together. Obviously, I was hoping everybody was going to come up with a solution, right? I'm very disappointed as well. But actually, I found quite a lot of hope in what was said, yeah? And perhaps the biggest hope for me is there's so many people questioning and trying to find a pathway. So I didn't go away thinking, oh shit, you know, what happened to the blueprint? What happened to the pathway? You know, I expected a framework for this. In fact, I'd be more worried if that happened, to be honest. But anyway, panel, you know, if you've got a solution in your back pocket, whip it out in a minute. Is that another question?
I would like to add to that maybe in terms of Mike in particular, because I think we heard from Simon, which was mostly a regulation policy can make it spiel, which is the usual green capitalism. I don't mean that in a derogative fashion, Simon. But I think, Mike, by the same terms, what we have heard from you was the usual degrowth speech, which, as we've seen in a recent report that we were talking about, a lot of these degrowth theories lack detail. So what exactly is your economic picture beyond saying we need to live within boundaries of the planet? Is that more regulation, as Simon is suggesting, or is it democratic socialism where we'll nationalize industries? What exactly does that translate into? And Hans, maybe if you can also go a little bit more into details. I liked your post today about the difference between finance, transitionary finance and finance transition. What does it mean for the finance system to go into Mike's direction?
Okay, thank you. So we'll count the questions there because they're both quite extensive. So maybe we'll take Hans and then we'll go to Mike, allow Mike to say something, and then we'll take another question. Hans, please.
Yes, great question. Maybe first I want to go into the concreteness of what we can do. I tried to say it already, but maybe I just give an example of what we tried to do as Traders Bank. We declared, I think, a few months ago that we are a post-growth bank. Nobody knows what it exactly means, so we gave our own definition on it. What we want to say with it, no, we did not say we're a post-growth bank. We are almost post-growth aligned. So you should be very careful on how you phrase it. What we meant by it is saying we already, from our foundation 40 years ago, excluded part of the economy where we don't see any use for. So actually, in degrowth terms, we say this should be phased out. Fossil fuels, we did 20 years ago some fossil fuel, but not anymore. But so you can, as a financial institution, even within the system, try to change the system by doing things differently. So make choices on what to finance, what not to finance, how to finance, what kind of returns you expect. You can make those choices if you have a client base that allows you to do so. And this is my second point. We can, because it's also about us, without pointing to anyone, take initiatives, grassroots movements, communities, try to do things differently, set examples, either as a company or as private individuals, cooperatives, whatever. And that's also part of of course, of the post-growth, degrowth literature that gives that examples. And that's not easy because we live in a different system. But if you want to change the system, you have to set examples on what you can do differently. So that's one part on how I think it can be very concrete. Also in terms of, even in terms of policies, you can also say, without making it about post-growth, say, oh, hey, let's look at our tax system. Oh, the tax base is all about growth. So it's value-added tax, it's income tax, and if the tax base grows, tax income growth grows, so your budget system is growth dependent. You can also say, hey, maybe it's a better idea to go to wealth, to go to pollution and other tax bases, which is not per se post or degrowth, but it is a better system. So you can do a lot of things, very small steps, very concrete things that allows you to come closer to a different system without saying it's completely different. And I don't know if it's enough. Then the question on finance, yeah, I had yesterday or the day before a post about, but it was really about the financial system. What you see now, we have a lot of buzz and talk about transition finance. And transition finance is going from very polluting to less polluting, or going from very brown to less brown. And we call it sustainable. And my point is there is a complete difference between transition finance and financing a transition or a transformation, where you have a clear endpoint, also relating to the point I made before. You have an idea where you want to go, either post-growth or even a sustainable scenario, a sustainable place where you want to be. So sustainable finance can, in my opinion, only be that you finance something that has an endpoint, at least that sustainable world. And if you do anything else, it's not sustainable. So that's for me the difference between those two.
If I can add, Hans, he said, with the true transformation, the power at the end of the transformation is never where it was at the beginning of the transformation. I think that's important.
Okay, very good. So Mike, you will get a chance to respond at the end, so we won't bring you in now. Let's have one more question.
Just a comment and a question, very briefly. What I think was very interesting in the whole premise of the Polycrisis was that we focus so much on climate change, on social issues, and I think Dominique said, and several others, what about justice? And I think one of the, if we could rephrase it from my standpoint, this is the question: have we not just seen an extensive crisis in rights all through our sort of democratic world? And absent proper rights, then how can we even have an infrastructure to begin to have a transformation? Because the law, and I just would remind people that there was a case between Shell and the directors that was lost on the basis that the fiduciary duties of the directors could not be to look at a wider picture in terms of the responsibilities of Shell to perhaps overall stakeholders, but just to their own shareholders. So I think there is, and this is the question, I think there is a framework in place which ITLOS, which is the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea, has made, and it's made it very clear that we as the polluters must have a framework for everyone, the commons, to be brought into their disenfranchisement. And this is not the first time that it's happened in the history of mankind. So I'm much more optimistic in that some comments.
Okay. So I just want to inject a question, and then we'll ask Tim and Dominic if they want to respond to any of them. So and Rachel and you as well. So my question is, it's really about the speed of change. And so, we've talked about, so we have been concerned about the fact that, there's urgent need to address, and Rupert, you made the point well about where we are. My concern is around technology, because I think technology is the thing which has driven us in a particular direction very fast, and it's getting faster. And unfortunately, if that technology is being co-opted by the incumbents and it requires significant investment, and so therefore it becomes an exclusive right for the incumbents, and they're ploughing into the existing system, then we just see sort of growth on growth, or sort of the exponential exploitation of the system that we've got, the increasing inequality, et cetera, et cetera. So I've got a very grave concern that, you know, left to its left as it is, if you like, you know, so we work on, you know, the transition, fine, but the rest of the system cracks on. My concern is that that's sort of, you know, speeding up on steroids, you know, through AI, the investment of AI and everything else. And so I just wonder whether, you know, that technology point or the concerned speed of change on the on one side is a grave concern. So I just dropped that in there, but let's hear from one of either Rachel, Tim, or Dominique.
Okay. I think I'm responding more to the question you had and the question you had, just touching on that. I just firstly want to say, I feel like we've had some more like optimism injected in here, but if I didn't have hope, I wouldn't still be an activist and I wouldn't be doing what I do. And I think it's an important thing for me to say, and also tagging on to what you said earlier, that every single one of us in our different positions in society really does have the power for that kind of change, and it's about making those changes where we are across society, because no house will be left unturned due to the climate crisis, so every house will have to change essentially. So I think what I want to touch on here is firstly just invite everyone, maybe the panelists, to actually envision what the future could look like. What's the future that we want to create? I do agree that as a movement we talk often about things we want to stop, which is incredibly important, but we don't often spread as much awareness about the kind of future we want to create. I know there are several alternative models out there. I'm not an expert. I know there are alternative models out there, like, you know, the well-being economics and the circular economics and donut economics, et cetera, et cetera. But for me, when I just thinking on kind of like a grassroots level, day-to-day, what would that kind of look like? I'm sure people can add in from their expertise on a wider scale. But just for me, some things include like steps to get to the world we want to create, include ecocide as law, meaning that industries literally will not be able to continue the destruction that they're doing, use community-owned renewable energy, warm insulated homes, circular fashion, locally grown food, community gardens, rewilding, public services that are funded and improving people's quality of life, health services that are funded. You know, as was mentioned, we have that, there's the issue of justice as well. When people are facing a cost of living crisis, they're facing a health crisis, it's so hard to imagine a future beyond that. And I feel like that's such an important thing to look at. And thank you for mentioning that earlier. And essentially a world, and also universal basic income, and essentially a world where every choice that is made on the business level, on the political level, the planet and people are put first. And it sounds very simple, and I know there's many, many things to it, but essentially it comes down to that. What exactly that looks like, I personally don't know in every sense of the word, but I think there are definitely things we can start imagining or thinking about that we can walk forward to create. I think we don't have to imagine what the entire system can look like before we make change. We have to start making those little changes to get there.
Sam.
Wanted to mention an experience I had when I went to Beijing. So I think the Chinese government, they have data, a lot of data on individuals, what they do. And I think this is how they could like contain like COVID during the lockdown. They even know when people go out. They knew when people went out of the house. Everything like that. So I wonder if this is a question of compromising our privacy, like the Western concept of individualism, liberty, and our privacy. Because if capitalism doesn't work, like for example, I took a subject of finance and sustainability at LBS, and we knew the function of greenhouse gas emissions was population, GDP, emissions. And emissions from eating meat, and nobody in the class said, I'm not, like, you know, I still like eating. Well, not nobody, like all the people in the class insisted on I like eating meat. And we talked about having fewer children, and like, why would I have fewer children? I want to have at least. And yeah, so I think the game theory kicks in when there is no change to the system, because this sense of liberty in the West. So perhaps there could be a metric system where we can compromise our privacy data and say our credit card companies, bank transactions can rate what we buy, how often we travel, and then say we have to pay more, like the individuals who do this or companies who do this have to pay more tax, but individuals who compromise, they get tax deductions. Metric system like this, I think.
Okay, thank you. So sorry, I know we've got many more questions, but I do just want to hear from Tim and then Rachel, and then we've got to hear Mike and Simon's response, and then we can continue obviously discussion later. So, Simon and Rachel.
Well, on the question about what's the solution, the idea that there's a solution is part of the problem. It's a process. There is no end to it. It's a process that goes on. But the way into that process, I believe, is that we change. It's that thing about I, we, us, and you have to find the touch points where you can affect change. And the most powerful touch point is the I, is the us. So doing that, developing the perception, developing the awareness, developing the connection to it, will drive much more powerful change in the we, in our forms of collaboration, which ultimately derives much more powerful change in the us, in society. And it's that thing about like in the development goals versus sustainable development goal. I have a feeling that Sam's been reading some of my blogs and is setting me up for a punchline here by asking about technology. Because picking up on Mike's point, if we really thought this was an emergency, we'd be on a war footing, and we'd be only doing the things that moved us in the right direction. And we wouldn't be innovating the next best product or the next version or the next iteration, because it's not in service to life. And things that are pleasurable to us that aren't in service to life sounds like masturbation to me. So I often think that most innovation is masturbation, because it's not furthering our ends, it's not in service of life. So I think Sam set that one up, so you can thank him for that. I'll leave it there.
I think perhaps you should, Tim. So Rachel, please.
Yeah. I'd like to comment, the war footing and war mobilization there's two people now that have used this kind of phrasing in this panel. And I really want to challenge it. Because as David Graeber said, when you decide that you're going to war, you've already decided that your opponent is no longer human, because they're no longer capable of language. They're no longer capable of discussion. And I think that in contrast to like talking about sort of a war mobilization, which is a very, very anthropomorphic thing as well, I would like to encourage people to go up and look up the work of like Jibao Lee or Maggie Roberts, artists who are using technology to create multipolar perspectives whereby we sort of imagine what nature wants to communicate with us with regards to their rights and their representation with regards to the decisions that are being made about our future. And I think that idea of like expanding who has a seat at the table to discuss what the world should look like is kind of the opposite and the necessary function compared to using like warlike imagery. Because yes, you know, the Second World War in the United Kingdom, when the women got out of the house and went to the factories and created all sorts of you know what to keep the country going while the men went off to die. Yeah, I can see it. I do think we can do better though. So just that. And then yeah, with regards to the solutions thing, like I feel a bit frustrated when I'm on panels and that's something that comes back. Like, you know, we all spend a lot of time working on this. You've got, you know, a bunch of experts in front of you with a huge combined knowledge who've been asked to come and deconstruct the problem. And then the very first thing is, well, what can I do? Well, I don't know. Keep listening until you figure out what you need to do. You know, there isn't like a global solution to this problem. There are local solutions. And I think the really wonderful thing about local solutions, whether they're like local technologies or local economies or local whatever, is that when you look at those on a scale level, they're not dangerous, all right? If you could imagine a global world where there are local economies that are connected to one another by networks, rather than huge swashes of money, billions and trillions of reserve currencies washing through the same economy, that's a dangerous model. It is brittle. It can collapse. If one country like the United States goes down, it takes everybody else down with it. Whereas we know that diverse ecosystems are resilient ecosystems. So I really do think that like flipping the problem, giving autonomy back to people, asking people to take autonomy whilst they still can, and growing your own food, deploying your own energy systems, getting involved in participative democracy, all of these things like that is essentially how you begin to build a new world. And so I would encourage you to go out and figure out what you can do, because I can't tell you. And anybody that comes along and says, this is the blueprint for the world, as has already been said, don't trust them. No, lock them out the back and tell them to stay away. That's dangerous. It's just dangerous. Finally, just one little comment. Whilst I agree, like this is a problem of relationality, there are language games at play here. We need to look at our relationships to one another. You know, the whole like the problem begins at home, the I, the we, the us. There's an element of truth to that. I do also think that we do need to maintain the framing of like that is possible in a hugely privileged culture where we can have these kinds of conversations about the I and the we and the us and the autonomy and the whatever. If you look at other cultures around the world that are subject to genocides, that are subject to military coups, that are subject to having their political autonomy ripped away from them, looking at the women at the moment with the Taliban, like it's not a given. So I think it's important to use whatever selfhood and communityhood we have in a time when that's not given for the rest of the world, but we must also be careful of the framing of like that being the core tenet, because it's just not the case for a lot of people around the world. So I think I've probably shouted enough now, and I'll hand back over. Thank you.
Okay, so unfortunately we're coming towards the end of our session. So Mike, you're up first, then you, Simon. You don't have 5 minutes anymore. You have really a couple of minutes, then we're going to vote, and then we will close. So Mike, over to you.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks everyone for the wonderful contributions and questions. There's lots of things I would love to respond to if there is time, but I think maybe kind of the most important thing that's come up is kind of like, well, like what's our vision of an alternative system? I didn't have time to discuss that in my opening, and because building on kind of the point that Rachel was just making, I think when we're talking about alternative systems, we're not talking about like here's the solution that's going to solve everything and you know implement this blueprint and then everything's solved. It's more like kind of moving towards an alternative framework that would liberate more people to pursue alternative solutions that are beyond the confines of capitalism, beyond the confines of a society based on endless growth that, constrains the solution space within parameters that, are only that contribute to GDP more or less. And so how do we create a different kind of system that does not confine our imaginations, does not confine investment, production, and, economic activity within those parameters? And so basically we're trying to get to a different kind of society in which the directives of capital are not imposed on the rest of society, more or less. And so whether we want to call that democratic socialism, well-being economy, degrowth, I'm open, let 1,000 concepts bloom. So I would say that, it does not mean Soviet-style central planning. It does not mean abolishing markets. We're not talking about totally abolishing private enterprise and private property, but we're talking about a more pluralist political and economic ecology in which a wider diversity of non-capitalist practices can flourish. So things like nonprofits, worker cooperatives, there'd be a role for state-owned enterprises and nationalization of large corporations, but also many different kinds of collectively managed provisioning systems at different scales, what are often called commons. And so decisions about production and investment would be much more democratically shaped by ordinary people in this kind of world. And so this could involve things like citizens' assemblies, participatory budgeting, new kinds of ownership structures where a wider range of stakeholders kind of have an ownership stake and decision-making power in large corporate entities. And so there's many ways you could think about like kind of what that might look like. There would be many different variants, just like there are different varieties of capitalism. But the aim at the core is to create a different kind of economy where the directives of capital no longer reign supreme. And that's the only way that we're going to be able to address the Earth system crisis with the speed, the urgency, and the justice that this crisis demands.
Tom?
Sorry, the link broke there for a moment. Did you say me?
Yep, you're on.
Yeah, okay. Would really appreciated everybody's comments and enjoyed listening and would like to listen more. I found I'm agreeing with the vast majority of what everybody said on how bad is our problem and all the different dimensions of it. Agree with what everybody said, including the comment from the floor that 1.5 degrees is probably in the rearview mirror. Most fundamentally, I think I really agree with Mike about the different depths of change that can happen at different paces and the compatibility of pursuing those at the same time. I think that's a crucial point that underlies a lot of what we've been discussing and actually brings a lot of it into more agreement than it might look superficially. One of the points where I think I differ slightly is in talking about decoupling, whether we've been able to decouple growth from emissions or from material use. I think it's not quite right to say that there's no evidence for that. If you look at the economy-wide scale, and if you don't think about the time lags between action and effect, then it looks like that. But that's missing what's really happening. If you look at the relatively smaller areas of the economy where we have actually tried and done some of the things that we need to do, then the effects have actually been spectacular. And we've made much faster progress than anybody expected in decoupling growth from emissions. With decoupling from material, the efforts are much less so far. But equally, there are approaches that have been seen to work. They just haven't been scaled up yet. So I think that's some cause for optimism. The final point I want to make is a bit of a subtle one, but it's about holism and also the need for focus. All of the problems we're talking about are interconnected. Everything in the universe is interconnected. And yet, there's a risk that if you simply contemplate that, then it leads to paralysis. You have to grip a part of it and find something you can do with it. You have to focus on a part of the problem to create change. The first rule of systems thinking is define your system boundary. If I can put it a crude way, in government, you often get stuck in these conversations of people saying, well, what about this? What about that? What about the link to so-and-so? And it always used to make me think of a different version of the phrase that you can't polish a turd, which is that you can link a turd to another turd, but they're both still turds. And that doesn't really help you. In other words, if you want to solve any one of these interlinked problems of climate change, biodiversity loss, social justice, democracy, exploitation, so on, you have to solve it on its own terms, not just in the linkage with the other problems. So if your solution to climate change doesn't actually work for climate change, it's not a solution. So I think Dominique put it more elegantly by saying that we don't have to imagine what the entire system should look like before we try to make change. I think that's the crucial point I want to end on. Thanks.
And just humour me with the 30 seconds to vote, please. Tim, do you mind doing the count in the room as I try and get this to work here? So hang on.
Does that mean I can't vote?
You weren't allowed to vote anyway, right? Here we go. So we've launched it online, please. So Transform, sorry, what, I've screwed up? Oh, no, I've messed up, okay. If you can hear me online, so basically that's change, transform and replace, not transform and replace.
You're screaming it now, Sam.
No, okay, I'm not, okay, so change, hands up. 1, transform. Thanks, Tim, you're doing that very well. Yeah. So don't just put your hand up because other people are putting your hand up, right? Okay, replace. I'm sorry. Well, next one. Okay, so what was that, Tim? What's that looking like? So 53 and 47. Second one. Okay, you failed.
Mainly the middle one, mainly transform.
Okay, so I think we've nudged people away. We've nudged people, so I'll end that and show you what you've got there. Show the results. Can you see the results? Yeah. Okay, so without a doubt, the people, you see where I screwed up, everybody? Yeah, sorry about that. So without a doubt, the people in the room, I would say marginally more conservative, but marginally. So we don't have any changes anymore. So they've also moved apart from one. So you can make the case next time. So what I'll do, there's a lot of Q&A online, and I did say we weren't going to take questions online because it just becomes too difficult. We will publish those. We will respond to those. We have recorded this, so we will put that online and make it accessible to people. I'm going to have a look at it and see what I'm going to do with it. If anybody wants to join me within that, then put up your hands and let's do it together. But thank you very much indeed, everybody who's come, both online and here in the room. Thank you very much indeed for our two sort of opening speakers in terms of Mike and Simon, who are in California and Japan. And for Dominic, Tim, Hans and Rachel, thank you so much for your contributions as well. So with that, I'm going to close. Thank you, and thank you again.
Thank you very much.